The hammer came down on the last piece of furniture in the house, and with it, everything Evelyn Ashworth had ever known. She stood at the bottom of the grand staircase, watching strangers carry away her mother's writing desk, her father's books, and the paintings that had hung on these walls since before she was born. Her hands were clenched so tightly that her nails left small marks in her palms, but she did not cry. She had promised herself she would not cry. Not in front of these men. Not in front of anyone. 3 days earlier, her father had been found still in his study. His heart stopped in the middle of the night. The doctor said it was the strain that killed him, the weight of debts no one in the family had known existed. Evelyn had believed her father to be a careful man, a fair man, someone who built his fortune through honest work and patience. She had believed that, until the lawyers arrived with their papers and their quiet, pitying looks, and told her that House Ashworth was drowning in debt that stretched back nearly 6 years. 6 years. Evelyn did the count again in her head as she watched a stranger wrap her mother's mirror in cloth. 6 years ago, her father had entered into a business partnership that had promised to double the family fortune within a single season. 6 years ago, everything had started to go wrong, slowly, quietly, until it exploded into ruin the moment his heart gave out. And at the center of it all, according to everyone who dared to whisper the name, stood one man, Julian Hale, the Duke of Blackwood. Evelyn had never met the Duke. She knew him only through rumor, through the frightened tones of servants and the careful silence of her father whenever his name came up at dinner. She knew that the Duke was known across the country for being cold, calculating, and utterly without mercy in matters of business. Some called him ruthless, others simply called him dangerous. It was said that no one crossed the Duke of Blackwood and came away unharmed. It was Mr. Harold Grant, an old friend of her father's, who told her the truth of what had happened, or at least the truth as he understood it. He came to the house the evening before the lawyers arrived, his face pale, his voice trembling with something between grief and fury. "Your father trusted him," Harold said, sitting across from her in the parlor that would soon no longer belong to her family. "He trusted Blackwood with everything, and the Duke used that trust to build his own fortune, while your father's crumbled beneath him. I warned him, Evelyn. I told him something was wrong, but he wouldn't hear it. He said the Duke was a man of his word." "Then why would he do this?" Evelyn asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Harold shook his head. "Men like the Duke of Blackwood do not need reasons. They only need opportunities. And your father, God rest him, gave him every opportunity in the world." Evelyn had sat with those words for 3 days now, turning them over and over in her mind like stones in a riverbed, until they had worn smooth and hard and become something she believed without question. The Duke had ruined her father. The Duke had taken everything from her family and left nothing behind but debt and shame. And now, as she watched her childhood home being stripped bare before her eyes, she made herself a promise. She would find a way to make him pay. It was not vengeance in the way of swords or shouting matches. Evelyn was not foolish enough to think she could challenge a duke to any kind of open conflict and win. She had no money, no title beyond what remained of her family name, and no power in a world that measured a woman's worth by her father's fortune or her husband's rank. But she had her wits, and she had a will made of iron, forged in the fire of watching her family fall apart in front of her. She began asking questions. Quiet ones, careful ones, the kind that would not draw attention to themselves. She spoke with the servants, who remained loyal to her, with the shopkeepers in town, who had heard things through the grapevine of gossip that ran through every great house, and slowly, a picture began to form. The Duke of Blackwood was unmarried. He had reached an age where society expected him to have already secured an heir, and yet he remained without a wife, a fact that had become the subject of endless speculation among the noble families of the region. Some said he was too cold-hearted to love anyone. Others said he was searching for a match that would serve his political ambitions, something to solidify his standing among the other great houses of the land. It was this last rumor that caught Evelyn's attention and refused to let go. If the Duke needed a wife of noble blood to secure his position, then perhaps there was a way inside his world that did not require an army or a fortune. Perhaps all it required was patience, and a willingness to become something she had never imagined being, the wife of the very man who had destroyed her family. The thought terrified her at first. She sat awake at night turning it over, imagining herself walking down an aisle toward a man she despised, imagining the years of her life spent beside someone she believed capable of such cruelty. But then she would think of her father's empty study, of her mother's mirror wrapped in cloth and carried away by strangers, and the fear would harden into resolve. If she could get close enough to the Duke, she could find proof of what he had done. She could uncover the truth behind the business dealings that had ruined her father, and she could expose him for what he truly was, in front of the very society that respected and feared him. And if that meant she had to become his wife to do it, then so be it. She would play the part as long as it took. She began, first, by changing the way she presented herself to the world. Gone were the plain dresses of a grieving daughter, replaced instead with careful, composed elegance that spoke of quiet dignity rather than desperation. She learned, through careful observation, the sort of woman the Duke was rumored to admire: intelligent but not overly opinionated, graceful but not vain, calm in a way that suggested she would never embarrass him in front of his peers. It took nearly 2 months of careful maneuvering before Evelyn found her opportunity. A grand gathering was to be held at the estate of Lord Pembroke, one of the few noble families who still extended invitations to the remaining members of House Ashworth out of old loyalty to her father. It was said that the Duke of Blackwood would be in attendance, along with half the noble families in the region, all hoping to catch his eye or secure some favor from his growing influence. Evelyn arrived at the gathering with her heart pounding beneath a composed exterior. She wore a gown of deep blue, simple in its design but elegant in its cut, and she had spent the better part of an hour ensuring that not a single hair was out of place. She needed to be seen. She needed to be remembered, but more than anything, she needed to be perfect. The evening moved slowly at first, filled with polite conversation and careful introductions, the kind of empty small talk that Evelyn had grown so tired of in the months since her father's death. She danced with a few gentlemen who meant nothing to her, smiled at jokes she did not find amusing, and all the while, her eyes searched the crowded room for a single face she had never seen before, but somehow knew she would recognize instantly. She found him near the far end of the ballroom, standing apart from the crowd, in a way that spoke of deliberate distance rather than shyness. He was tall, with dark hair, and an expression that gave away nothing of what he was thinking. He held a glass of wine he did not seem interested in drinking, and his eyes moved across the room with the careful, assessing gaze of a man used to measuring people for their usefulness rather than their charm. Evelyn felt something cold settle in her stomach as she looked at him. This was the man who had destroyed her family. This was the man whose signature, whose word, whose careful business dealings had left her father broken and her family's name in ruins. She had expected to feel fury, and she did, but beneath it ran something else, something she did not have a name for yet, a strange and unwelcome curiosity about the man behind the reputation. She waited until the right moment presented itself, when Lord Pembroke himself moved to introduce a small group of guests to the Duke, and Evelyn made certain she was standing close enough to be included. Her heart hammered against her ribs as Lord Pembroke turned to her. "And this," Lord Pembroke said, gesturing toward her with the easy warmth of an old family friend, "is Lady Evelyn Ashworth. Her father was a good man, and a dear friend of mine." The Duke's eyes settled on her for the first time, and Evelyn forced herself to meet his gaze without flinching. There was something unreadable in his expression, something that made her wonder, for just a moment, whether he recognized her name and understood the connection to the man whose fortune he had allegedly ruined. But if he did, he gave no sign of it. "Lady Ashworth," he said, his voice low and measured, carrying none of the coldness she had expected. "I am sorry for the loss of your father." "Thank you, Your Grace," Evelyn replied, keeping her voice steady, her expression calm. "He spoke of many things in his final months. I am only now beginning to understand all of them." If the words carried a weight beyond their surface meaning, the Duke did not show it. He inclined his head politely and turned his attention to the rest of the group, and Evelyn was left standing there, her pulse racing, wondering if she had just taken the first step toward everything she wanted, or the first step toward a danger she did not yet understand. Over the following weeks, Evelyn made certain that her path crossed with the Duke's again and again, always by careful design, disguised as coincidence. She appeared at gatherings she knew he would attend, engaged in conversations that showcased her intelligence without threatening his pride, and slowly, carefully, she began to understand the shape of the man she intended to marry. He was not what she expected. The rumors painted him as cruel and heartless, a man who cared for nothing but his own advancement, and yet in the small moments Evelyn observed, she saw glimpses of something else. She saw him quietly settle a debt for a struggling merchant, without ever mentioning it to anyone. She saw him speak with genuine respect to servants that other nobles treated as furniture. She saw, in unguarded moments, a tiredness in his eyes that spoke of burdens she did not yet understand. But none of it changed what she believed to be true. Her father had trusted this man, and this man had destroyed him. Whatever kindness the Duke showed to strangers meant nothing next to the ruin he had brought upon her family. She held on to that belief the way a drowning woman holds onto a piece of driftwood, because without it, she was not sure what she would have left to carry her forward. It was at a private dinner, hosted by Lady Pembroke, weeks after their first meeting, that the Duke finally sought Evelyn out directly. She had not expected it, and for a moment, standing alone near the garden doors, while the rest of the guests mingled inside, she felt a flicker of fear that perhaps he had discovered her true purpose. "You seem to appear wherever I go, Lady Ashworth," he said, coming to stand beside her, his eyes on the garden rather than on her face. "I wonder if that is by chance, or by design." Evelyn's heart raced, but she kept her composure, her voice light and unbothered. "Perhaps a bit of both, Your Grace. Polite society is small, after all, when one moves in the right circles." He turned to look at her then, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke. "I am told," he said slowly, "that you have shown no interest in remarrying into any of the families that have courted you since your father's passing. Yet you attend every gathering where I am present. I find that curious." Evelyn's mind raced, searching for the right words, the ones that would not give away the truth, but would draw him closer all the same. "Perhaps, Your Grace, I have simply not yet found a match that interests me as much as securing my family's future does. A marriage built on convenience rather than sentiment might serve me better than one built on false promises." Something shifted in his expression, a flicker of understanding, or perhaps calculation. "That is a rare kind of honesty," he said. "Most women who seek my attention pretend at affection they do not feel. You, at least, admit to seeking convenience. Would you prefer the pretending, Your Grace?" "No," he said, and for the first time, something like the ghost of a smile touched his mouth. "I would not." It was in that moment, standing in the cool night air of Lady Pembroke's garden, that Evelyn understood her plan was working exactly as she had hoped. The Duke of Blackwood, the man rumored to be without mercy, without warmth, without any weakness at all, was beginning to look at her not as a stranger among many, but as someone worth considering. She did not know, not yet, that the letter which would one day change everything already existed, locked away in a drawer in his private study, waiting for the day the truth would finally come to light. She did not know that the man standing beside her in the garden carried a burden of his own, one that had nothing to do with cruelty and everything to do with a warning he had tried to give her father years before anyone had listened. All she knew, as she walked back into the warmth of the gathering with the Duke at her side, was that her plan had begun, and there was no turning back now. The proposal came sooner than Evelyn expected, and when it did, it arrived without flowers, without soft words, and without any of the gentle romance that young women were taught to dream about. It arrived instead in the form of a short letter, delivered by a servant one gray morning, asking Evelyn to call upon the Duke at his townhouse to discuss a matter of importance. She read the letter 3 times before she allowed herself to believe what it meant. Her hands trembled slightly as she folded the paper and set it aside, and she sat for a long while at her writing desk, staring out the window at the narrow street below, trying to steady the storm of feelings rising inside her. This was what she had worked toward. This was the door she had spent months trying to open, and yet now that it stood before her, she felt a strange hesitation she had not expected, a small, unwelcome voice in the back of her mind, asking whether she was ready to walk through it. She silenced the voice quickly. There was no room for hesitation now, not when she thought of her father's empty study, not when she thought of the strangers carrying her mother's mirror out the front door. She dressed carefully that afternoon and made her way to the Duke's townhouse with her spine straight and her resolve firmly back in place. The Duke received her in a study lined with books, the kind of room that spoke of quiet wealth rather than the loud display favored by lesser nobles trying to prove their worth. He stood when she entered, gestured for her to take a seat near the fireplace, and waited until the servant had closed the door behind them before he spoke. "I imagine you already suspect why I have asked you here," he said, his tone measured, businesslike, as though he were discussing a contract rather than a marriage. "I require a wife, Lady Ashworth. My position demands it, and my patience for the process of courtship has grown thin. You have made clear, in your own way, that you seek a marriage built on practical terms rather than sentiment. I find that arrangement suits me." Evelyn kept her expression composed, though her heart pounded loud enough that she wondered if he could hear it from across the room. "You are asking me to marry you, Your Grace?" "I am," he said simply. "I will provide for you, for your remaining family, and for any obligations left unresolved by your father's passing. In return, I ask only that you fulfill the duties expected of a duchess, and that you do not embarrass me in front of those whose opinions matter to my position." It was, Evelyn thought, perhaps the least romantic proposal any woman had ever received, and yet it was exactly what she needed. A cold, practical arrangement gave her the freedom to pursue her true purpose, without the complication of pretending affection she did not feel. She could marry this man, live beneath his roof, and search for the truth of what he had done to her family, all without the burden of guilt that might come from deceiving someone who loved her. "I accept, Your Grace," she said, and if her voice trembled slightly, she told herself it was only from the weight of the moment, nothing more. The wedding that followed was as practical and unadorned as the proposal that preceded it. There was no grand celebration, no lavish gathering of hundreds of guests. Instead, a small ceremony was held in the chapel attached to the Duke's country estate, attended only by a handful of witnesses, whose presence was required by law, rather than desired for sentiment. Evelyn wore a simple gown of pale gray, and the Duke wore his usual dark, severe attire, and the vows they exchanged were spoken in voices as calm and measured as any business agreement. When it was over, Evelyn found herself standing in the entrance hall of Blackwood Manor, the grand estate that would now be her home, staring up at ceilings so high they seemed to disappear into shadow, at portraits of ancestors she did not know staring down at her with painted eyes that felt somehow judgmental. She was a duchess now, in name if nothing else, and the weight of that new title settled over her like a heavy cloak she was not yet accustomed to wearing. The housekeeper, a warm but no-nonsense woman named Mrs. Whitcomb, showed her through the manor over the following days, introducing her to the small army of servants who kept the great house running, explaining the rhythms and routines of a household far larger and more complex than anything Evelyn had known growing up. She learned the names of the maids, the cook, the groundskeepers, and slowly, she began to understand the scope of what her new life would require of her. But beneath the polite lessons in household management, Evelyn's true purpose never wavered. Every quiet moment she could steal, every hallway she walked alone, every conversation with a servant who might know something useful, she used to search for clues about the business dealings that had ruined her father. She learned that the Duke kept most of his important papers in his private study, a room she had not yet been permitted to enter freely, and she began looking for opportunities to change that. The Duke himself remained a puzzle she could not quite solve. He was distant, but not unkind, businesslike, but not cruel, and in the small moments they shared over dinner, or in passing through the halls, Evelyn found herself noticing things she had not expected to notice. The way his shoulders carried a tension that seemed to ease only when he thought no one was watching. The way he sometimes paused before answering a question, as though weighing his words with more care than a simple conversation required. The way, once, she caught him staring at a portrait of a woman she did not recognize, his expression carrying a grief so deep it startled her. She asked Mrs. Whitcomb about the portrait one evening, careful to keep her tone casual. "That would be the Duke's mother, my lady," Mrs. Whitcomb said, her voice softening. "She passed when he was still quite young. It changed him, I believe. He was not always so guarded." The words stayed with Evelyn long after the conversation ended. She had built her entire plan around the belief that the Duke was a man without conscience, without remorse, a man who could ruin a family and feel nothing at all. But the more time she spent within these walls, the more she began to wonder if the story she had been told was as simple and complete as she had believed. Still, she reminded herself, kindness to servants, and grief for a lost mother did not undo the ruin he had brought upon her father. A man could carry sorrow in one hand and cruelty in the other, and Evelyn refused to let a few unguarded moments soften her resolve. She had come here for a purpose, and she intended to see it through. Her opportunity to search the Duke's study came nearly 3 weeks into their marriage, on an evening when he had been called away to attend to matters at one of his other properties, leaving the manor quiet and empty of his watchful presence. Evelyn waited until the household had settled for the night, until the last candle in the servants' quarters had been extinguished, and then she made her way down the darkened hallway toward the study, with a single candle held carefully in one hand. The door was unlocked, which surprised her, though she supposed the Duke had never imagined his new wife would dare to search his private papers so soon after their wedding. She slipped inside, closed the door softly behind her, and let her eyes adjust to the dim light before she began her search. The room was exactly as she remembered it from their first meeting here, lined with books and papers, a large desk positioned near the window, and shelves filled with documents that told the story of a man deeply involved in the business of the noble world. Evelyn began carefully, methodically, working her way through the papers on the desk first, searching for any mention of her father's name, any record of the business dealings that had led to his ruin. Most of what she found meant nothing to her, contracts and correspondence related to properties and investments she did not understand, written in the dense legal language that seemed designed to confuse anyone without years of training in such matters. She was beginning to lose hope of finding anything useful, when her eyes fell upon a drawer at the base of the desk, slightly recessed, with a small brass lock that suggested something more important was hidden inside. Her pulse quickened. She tried the drawer gently, confirming it was indeed locked, and she spent several long minutes searching the desk for a key, running her fingers along the underside of drawers and shelves, checking behind books for anything that might be hidden there. She found nothing, and as the candle burned lower, she realized she would need more time, and perhaps more skill, than she currently possessed, to open that drawer without breaking it. She was gathering herself to leave, disappointed but not defeated, when she heard the sound of footsteps in the hallway outside. Her heart leaped into her throat, and she quickly blew out the candle, plunging the room into near-total darkness, pressing herself against the wall beside the door as the footsteps drew closer. The door opened, and lamplight spilled into the room, and Evelyn found herself staring directly into the surprised, unreadable eyes of the Duke himself, home earlier than she had expected, standing in the doorway of his own study, with his new wife caught red-handed in the darkness within it. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Evelyn's mind raced through possible explanations, none of them convincing, all of them collapsing beneath the weight of the obvious truth. She had been caught searching through his private papers in the middle of the night. "Lady Ashworth," he said finally, his voice quiet, carrying none of the anger she had braced herself for. "I wonder what could possibly bring you to my study at this hour, in the dark, without so much as a candle to guide your way." Evelyn opened her mouth to speak, though she had no idea what words might come out, and in that silence, the true test of her carefully built plan finally began. The silence stretched between them, thick and uncomfortable, until Evelyn finally forced herself to speak. "I could not sleep, Your Grace. I came looking for a book to occupy my mind, and I did not wish to wake the household by asking a servant to light the way." It was a thin excuse, and she knew it the moment the words left her mouth, but the Duke did not immediately challenge it. Instead, he stepped further into the room, setting his lamp down on the desk, and studied her with an expression that gave away nothing of what he was thinking. "A book," he repeated slowly. "And did you find one to your liking?" "No, Your Grace. I confess I was still searching when you arrived." He glanced toward the shelves lining the walls, then back to her, and something in his gaze made Evelyn feel as though he could see straight through the careful construction of her lie. "This room holds few novels, Lady Ashworth. Mostly ledgers, correspondence, and legal matters. Not the sort of reading most young women find entertaining before bed." "Perhaps I am not most young women," she said, lifting her chin slightly, refusing to let her nerve break beneath his scrutiny. For a moment, something flickered across his face, an expression she could not quite name, somewhere between amusement and suspicion. "No," he said finally, "I do not believe you are." He did not press her further that night, though Evelyn could not tell whether it was because he believed her explanation, or because he simply chose not to pursue the matter in the moment. He escorted her from the study himself, his manner polite but distant, and bid her good night at the base of the staircase leading to her private chambers. But as she climbed the stairs alone, she could feel his eyes on her back, and she understood, with a cold certainty, that whatever trust might have existed between them had just grown a great deal more fragile. Over the following days, the Duke's manner toward her shifted in small, careful ways. He was not cold, exactly, but he grew more guarded, more measured in his words, as though he had drawn a curtain across some part of himself that he had previously allowed her to glimpse. Evelyn told herself this did not matter, that she had not married him for warmth or trust, but she found herself troubled by the change all the same, in ways she did not fully understand. It was during this uneasy period that an unexpected visitor arrived at Blackwood Manor, one whose presence would complicate matters far beyond anything Evelyn had anticipated. Lady Constance Vale arrived on a bright afternoon, announced by a servant with the sort of careful formality reserved for guests of considerable social standing. Evelyn had heard the name before, whispered among the noble families, as a woman who had once hoped to secure the Duke's hand herself before his marriage had been announced. Constance was beautiful in the practiced, polished way of women, who had spent their entire lives being told their appearance was their greatest asset, and she carried herself with the confidence of someone who did not believe her ambitions had truly been thwarted, merely delayed. "Your Grace," Constance said sweetly, greeting the Duke with a warmth that bordered on familiar, before turning her attention to Evelyn with a smile that did not quite reach her eyes. "And this must be your new Duchess. How fortunate you were to secure such a match, my lady, given the circumstances of your family's recent troubles." The insult was delivered so smoothly, wrapped in such polite phrasing, that Evelyn almost admired the skill of it, even as she felt her temper flare beneath her calm exterior. "Fortune had little to do with it, Lady Constance. I find that most good matches are built on more practical foundations than luck." Constance's smile tightened almost imperceptibly, and Evelyn understood, in that moment, that she had made an enemy without even trying. Over the following weeks, Constance found frequent reasons to visit the manor, to insert herself into gatherings where the Duke would be present, to remind him, in small and subtle ways, of a history between them that Evelyn had known nothing about before her arrival. Evelyn did her best to ignore the games Constance played, focusing instead on her true purpose within these walls, but the tension of the rivalry added a new layer of difficulty to her careful investigation. She could not risk appearing too curious about the Duke's private affairs, while Constance watched her every move with the sharp, assessing eyes of a woman looking for any weakness to exploit. It was during one particularly difficult evening, a dinner party hosted at the manor with Constance among the guests, that Evelyn found herself unexpectedly grateful for the Duke's presence beside her. Constance had spent much of the evening making pointed comments about the sudden nature of the marriage, about how quickly Evelyn had secured her position despite her family's troubles, and Evelyn had borne each comment with as much grace as she could manage. But when Constance finally overstepped, suggesting in front of the assembled guests that perhaps Evelyn had married for nothing more than financial security, the Duke's response surprised everyone at the table, Evelyn included. "My wife," he said, his voice carrying the same cool authority Evelyn had heard him use in matters of business, "is a woman of considerable intelligence and character, qualities I value a great deal more than the shallow gossip some seem so fond of repeating. I would ask that any further comments about her character be reserved for conversations she is not present to hear, if they must be made at all." The table fell silent, and Constance's face flushed with something between embarrassment and fury, but she said nothing further on the matter for the remainder of the evening. Later, as the guests departed and the manor grew quiet once more, Evelyn found herself standing alone with the Duke in the entrance hall, uncertain how to address what had just happened. "Thank you," she said finally, "for what you said at dinner." He studied her for a long moment before responding. "I meant every word, Lady Ashworth. Whatever else may exist between us, I will not tolerate my wife being spoken to with such disrespect beneath my own roof." Something about the sincerity in his voice unsettled her more than any cruelty could have. It would have been easier, she thought, if he had remained the cold, ruthless figure she had imagined before their marriage. It would have been easier to hate him, to justify the deception she carried forward each day, if he gave her any reason to believe the rumors that had brought her here in the first place. But standing in that quiet hall, watching the flicker of lamplight play across his face. Evelyn felt the first true crack form in the foundation of certainty she had built her entire plan upon. And though she pushed the feeling away quickly, telling herself it meant nothing, she could not fully silence the small, growing voice that whispered a question she was not yet ready to answer. What if the man she had married was not the man who had ruined her father at all? The thought followed her to bed that night, and it followed her through the days that came after, growing louder each time she caught the Duke in a moment of unexpected kindness, each time she watched him deal fairly with a servant or a tenant who came to him with a grievance. She began to notice things she had overlooked before, in her singular focus on vengeance. The careful way he managed the estate's finances to ensure no worker went without fair wages. The quiet donations he made to causes he never spoke of publicly. The genuine respect with which the household staff addressed him, not out of fear, but out of something that looked remarkably like loyalty freely given. None of it erased the debt her father had drowned in, or the ruin that had scattered her family's fortune to the wind. But it complicated the simple story she had told herself for months, the story that had given her the strength to walk into this marriage, with her eyes fixed on revenge, rather than fear. She resolved, as autumn settled over the grounds of Blackwood Manor, and the leaves began to turn, that she would find a way back into that locked drawer, no matter the risk. She needed proof, one way or another. She needed to know, with absolute certainty, whether the man she had married was the villain of her family's story, or something far more complicated than she had ever allowed herself to imagine. Winter arrived at Blackwood Manor, with a quiet, creeping cold that settled into every corner of the great house, and with it came a strange shift in the rhythm of Evelyn's days. She had expected marriage to a man she believed responsible for her family's ruin to feel like a constant battle, a performance she maintained every waking hour. Instead, she found herself slipping, almost without meaning to, into moments of genuine ease within these walls. It happened first in small ways. She began joining the Duke for breakfast each morning, not out of obligation, but because she found she looked forward to the quiet conversations they shared over tea and toast, discussions that ranged from the management of the estate to books they had both read, to the strange, small observations of daily life that neither of them seemed to share with anyone else. He was, she discovered, a man of surprising wit beneath his guarded exterior, capable of dry humor that caught her off guard and made her laugh before she remembered she was not supposed to enjoy his company quite so much. One morning, as snow fell steadily outside the windows of the breakfast room, Evelyn watched the Duke read through a stack of correspondence with the same careful attention he gave to everything, and found herself asking a question she had wondered about for weeks. "Why have you never spoken of your mother?" she asked, the words slipping out before she had fully decided to voice them. The Duke's hand stilled over his letter, and for a long moment, Evelyn wondered if she had overstepped some boundary she did not yet understand. But when he looked up, his expression carried no anger, only a quiet, tired sort of grief that made her regret the question even as she waited for his answer. "She died when I was 12, he said finally, a fever that took her within a week of its first appearance. My father never recovered from the loss, not truly. He grew distant, cold, focused entirely on the business of the estate, as though numbers and contracts could fill the space she left behind. I suppose I learned to do the same." "Is that why people believe you to be ruthless?" Evelyn asked, and immediately wished she could take the question back, though something in her needed to hear his answer. He set down his letter and studied her with an expression she could not fully read. "Is that what you believed, Lady Ashworth, before our marriage? That I was ruthless?" The question hung in the air between them, heavier than she had expected, and Evelyn found herself unable to give a simple answer. "I believed what I was told," she said carefully. "That you were a man who cared for nothing beyond your own advancement. That you would ruin anyone who stood between you and what you wanted." Something flickered across his face, quick and gone before she could name it. "And what do you believe now?" Evelyn held his gaze, and for the first time since her father's death, she found herself uncertain of her own answer. "I am no longer sure what I believe," she admitted quietly. The conversation ended there, interrupted by the arrival of a servant, with news of a matter requiring the Duke's attention. But the exchange stayed with Evelyn for days afterward, turning over and over in her mind, like a puzzle she could not quite solve. The man across the breakfast table each morning bore so little resemblance to the villain she had constructed in her imagination that she found herself questioning the very foundation of everything she had believed to be true. It was around this time that Mr. Harold Grant, the family friend who had first told her of the Duke's alleged role in her father's ruin, arrived unexpectedly at Blackwood Manor, requesting a private audience with Evelyn, under the guise of checking on her well-being since the marriage. She received him in the small drawing room, uneasy about the visit though she could not say exactly why. Harold looked much as he had the last time she had seen him, though something in his manner seemed sharper, more calculated than she remembered from the grieving days following her father's death. "You look well, Evelyn," he said, settling into a chair across from her. "Marriage to the Duke appears to suit you. Thank you for your concern, Mr. Grant, though I confess I am surprised by your visit. It has been some time." "I have been occupied with matters of my own," he said, waving a hand dismissively. "But I find myself thinking of your father often, and of the circumstances that led to his passing. I wonder, Evelyn, whether your new position within these walls has given you any insight into the truth of what happened to his fortune." The question struck Evelyn as strange, too direct, too eager, and she found herself studying Harold with a new wariness she had not felt in his presence before. "I have found little evidence of anything, Mr. Grant. The Duke keeps his private affairs closely guarded." "Of course," Harold said smoothly, though something in his eyes suggested disappointment at her answer. "But surely, given time, you will find what you are looking for. Your father deserves justice, Evelyn. Do not let comfort within these walls cause you to forget that." The comment left Evelyn unsettled long after Harold had departed. She had never mentioned to him, not explicitly, the true purpose behind her marriage to the Duke, and yet his words carried an assumption that she was actively searching for evidence against her husband, an assumption that felt uncomfortably accurate despite her growing doubts. She began to wonder, in the days that followed, exactly how much Harold knew, and exactly why he seemed so invested in uncovering proof of the Duke's guilt. The thought nagged at her during quiet moments, growing louder each time she recalled the strange intensity in his eyes as he had spoken of her father's fortune. Meanwhile, Constance Vale's presence in the social circles surrounding Blackwood Manor showed no signs of diminishing, and if anything, her attempts to undermine Evelyn's position grew more frequent as winter deepened. At a gathering hosted by one of the neighboring estates, Constance cornered Evelyn near the refreshment table, her voice pitched low enough that only Evelyn could hear the venom beneath her polite tone. "I wonder how long you truly believe this marriage will last, Lady Ashworth," Constance said, swirling her wineglass with practiced ease. "The Duke married you out of convenience, nothing more. Do not mistake his politeness for affection. I know him far better than you do, and I assure you, his heart belongs to no one. Perhaps you should ask him yourself, Lady Constance, rather than assuming you understand his heart better than he does," Evelyn replied, keeping her voice steady despite the unwelcome sting of Constance's words. Constance's smile sharpened. "Oh, I have asked him, my dear, many times, long before you appeared in his life to claim what should have been mine." The words lingered with Evelyn long after the gathering ended, planting small seeds of doubt she had not expected to feel. She told herself Constance's jealousy meant nothing, that the woman's bitterness spoke more of her own disappointment than any truth about the Duke's feelings. But alone in her chambers that night, staring at her reflection in the mirror, Evelyn found herself wondering, for the first time, whether she had begun to want something from this marriage beyond the truth she had come seeking. The realization frightened her more than any confrontation with Constance ever could. She had built her entire plan around vengeance, around the cold, careful pursuit of justice for her father. She had not accounted for the possibility that she might come to care, even a little, for the man she had married under false pretenses. She resolved to push the feeling aside, to refocus her efforts on the true purpose that had brought her to Blackwood Manor in the first place. Whatever confusion had begun to grow in her heart, it changed nothing about the debt owed to her father's memory. She needed the truth, and she intended to find it, no matter what she discovered about her own feelings along the way. That resolve was tested sooner than she expected, when a small fire broke out in a storage room adjacent to the Duke's study late one evening, sending the household into a brief but urgent panic as servants rushed to contain the flames before they could spread. In the chaos that followed, Evelyn found herself alone, near the study, for the first time since the night she had been caught searching through its papers, and she realized, with a pounding heart, that this might be her only chance to finally uncover what lay hidden within that locked drawer. Smoke still hung faintly in the air of the hallway as Evelyn slipped into the Duke's study, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and determination. The household remained occupied with the aftermath of the fire, servants carrying buckets of water and checking for any remaining embers, and she knew this small window of chaos would not last long. If she wanted answers, this was her chance. The study was dim, lit only by the pale light spilling in from the hallway, and Evelyn moved quickly to the desk, kneeling before the locked drawer that had haunted her thoughts for weeks. She had come prepared this time, having spent several evenings practicing with an old hairpin on the simple lock of her own jewelry box, learning the delicate art of coaxing a lock open without the proper key. Her hands trembled slightly as she worked the pin into the mechanism, listening for the small click that would signal success. It took longer than she expected, long enough that sweat began to form at her brow despite the winter chill in the room. But finally, she felt the lock give way beneath her careful manipulation. She pulled the drawer open slowly, half expecting to find nothing but empty space, a joke played by her own overactive imagination. Instead, she found a small wooden box, plain and unremarkable, tucked into the back of the drawer. She lifted it out carefully, her fingers trembling as she opened the lid, and found inside a stack of papers and a single sealed letter, the wax seal cracked with age, addressed in careful handwriting to a name that made Evelyn's breath catch in her throat. Lord Edmund Ashworth, her father. She stared at the letter for a long moment, her mind racing through the possibilities of what it might contain. Proof, perhaps, of the very scheme that had ruined her family, written in the Duke's own hand and preserved as some sort of trophy of his cruelty. Or perhaps something else entirely, something she was not prepared to consider. The sound of footsteps in the hallway snapped her back to the present moment, and Evelyn quickly closed the box, tucking it beneath her arm, as she rose from her kneeling position beside the desk. She had no time to read the letter here, not with the risk of discovery so immediate, and she made a swift decision, slipping the box beneath the folds of her skirt as she moved toward the door. She emerged into the hallway just as a servant hurried past, too occupied with the aftermath of the fire to notice the Duchess standing near the study door, and Evelyn made her way quickly to her own chambers, her heart still racing from the narrow escape. Once safely behind her locked door, she set the box on her writing desk and stared at it for a long moment, gathering the courage to finally learn the truth. She opened the letter with careful, trembling fingers, breaking the old wax seal and unfolding the yellowed paper within. The handwriting was neat, precise, unmistakably the Duke's, and as Evelyn began to read, the world around her seemed to fall away entirely. The letter was dated nearly 6 years earlier, written in a tone of urgent concern that Evelyn had not expected from a man she believed capable of such calculated cruelty. In it, the Duke warned her father, in careful but direct language, against entering into a business partnership with a man named Charles Whitmore, a merchant who had approached several noble families with promises of extraordinary returns on investments in overseas trade. The Duke wrote of evidence he had gathered suggesting Whitmore's scheme was built on false promises, that the ships he claimed to be financing did not exist, that the returns he promised to investors were paid not from actual profits, but from the money of new investors drawn into the scheme by tales of others' success. He begged her father to withdraw any commitment he had made, to protect his family's fortune before it was too late, and he offered, in the final lines of the letter, to personally investigate Whitmore's claims further and provide proof of the deception if her father required it before making his final decision. Evelyn read the letter 3 times, her hands shaking, her mind struggling to reconcile its contents with everything she had believed for the past 6 months. This was not a letter from a man scheming to ruin her father's fortune. This was a warning, urgent and sincere, from a man trying to prevent exactly the disaster that had eventually befallen House Ashworth. She turned to the other papers in the box and found further correspondence, records of the Duke's own investigation into Whitmore's business dealings, notes detailing inconsistencies in shipping records and financial statements that supported everything he had written in his letter. There were also several letters that appeared to be responses from her father, though these were less detailed, brief acknowledgments that gave no indication of whether he had heeded the Duke's warning or dismissed it entirely. The final document in the box was the most damning of all, a copy of a letter the Duke had sent to several other noble families around the same time, warning them away from Whitmore's scheme in similarly urgent terms. Evelyn recognized several of the names, families who had indeed avoided the ruin that had befallen her own, families whose fortunes remained intact while her father's had crumbled into nothing. Her father had not listened. Whether out of pride, or trust in a friendship with Whitmore that ran deeper than his caution, or simply because he had already committed too much before the Duke's warning reached him, Lord Ashworth had ignored the caution offered to him, and continued down the path that eventually led to his ruin and his death. And somehow, in the aftermath of that ruin, the blame had fallen not on Whitmore, the true architect of the scheme, but on the Duke of Blackwood, the very man who had tried to prevent it. Evelyn sat back in her chair, the letters scattered before her, and felt the entire foundation of her understanding crumble away like the walls of a building undermined from within. Every belief she had carried into this marriage, every ounce of resolve that had driven her to deceive and investigate the man she had married, had been built upon a lie she had never thought to question. She thought of Harold Grant's urgent questions during his recent visit, his eagerness to know whether she had found evidence of the Duke's guilt, and a cold, sickening suspicion began to form in her mind. If the Duke was innocent, if Whitmore was the true villain of her family's story, then who had first planted the rumor that placed the blame so squarely on the Duke's shoulders? She needed to know more. She needed to understand exactly what role Charles Whitmore had played, not just in her father's ruin, but in the reputation that had followed the Duke for years, the reputation that had painted him as ruthless and without mercy, when the truth suggested something entirely different. But first, she needed to decide what to do with the truth she now held in her trembling hands. She had deceived this man from the very first moment they met, had married him under false pretenses, had spent months searching his private study for evidence of a crime he had never committed. The weight of that deception settled over her now, with a heaviness she had not anticipated, made all the more painful by the growing realization that her feelings toward him had shifted into something far more complicated than the cold, practical arrangement she had originally intended. She sat with the letters until the candle beside her burned low, wrestling with the question of what came next. Should she confront the Duke immediately, confess everything, and beg his understanding for the deception that had brought her into his life? Or should she use this newfound knowledge carefully, first uncovering the full truth of Whitmore's role, before revealing her own part in the story that had unfolded within these walls? A soft knock at her door interrupted her thoughts, and Evelyn quickly gathered the letters back into their box, tucking them beneath a stack of her own correspondence, just as the door opened to reveal the Duke himself, his expression carrying a concern she had not seen from him before. "I heard you retired early after the fire," he said, stepping into the room with careful hesitation, as though unsure of his welcome. "I wanted to make certain you were unharmed." Evelyn looked at him. This man she had married for revenge, this man she now understood, had been wrongly blamed for a crime committed by someone else entirely, and felt something shift deep within her chest, a mixture of guilt and tenderness she did not know how to name. "I am unharmed," she said quietly. "Thank you for checking on me." He studied her for a long moment, something in his gaze suggesting he sensed a change in her, though he could not have known its true cause. "You seem troubled, Lady Ashworth. Is there something on your mind?" Evelyn hesitated, the truth pressing urgently against her lips, desperate to be spoken. But she was not ready yet, not until she understood the full scope of what had happened, not until she knew for certain how to make right the deception she had carried into this marriage from its very first day. "I am only tired," she said finally, the lie feeling heavier on her tongue than any she had told before. "The excitement of the evening has worn on me more than I expected." He nodded, accepting her answer, though something in his expression suggested he did not fully believe it, and bid her good night before withdrawing from the room. Evelyn sat alone in the quiet darkness that followed, staring at the box of letters hidden beneath her correspondence, and understood that everything about her carefully constructed plan had just changed beyond recognition. Evelyn did not sleep that night. She lay awake, staring at the canopy above her bed, the letters hidden beneath her correspondence, weighing on her mind, like stones sinking slowly through water. By morning, she had made a decision. Before she confessed anything to the Duke, before she risked shattering whatever fragile trust had begun to grow between them. She needed to understand the full truth of what had happened to her father, and what role Charles Whitmore had truly played in the disaster that followed. She began her search carefully, mindful now of the danger in moving too quickly or too openly. She wrote letters under the guise of simple social correspondence to several of the families named in the Duke's old warnings, women she had met briefly at various gatherings over the past months, asking careful questions about their own experiences with investment opportunities several years earlier. Most of the replies she received were polite but vague, until one letter arrived from Lady Winifred Carow, a woman whose family had nearly lost everything to Whitmore's scheme, before pulling out at the last moment on the strength of the Duke's warning. Lady Carow's letter was detailed and grateful, praising the Duke's foresight in uncovering Whitmore's deception before it could claim her family's fortune, as it had claimed others. She wrote of how her husband had nearly dismissed the warning entirely, trusting in Whitmore's charm and the glowing reports of other investors, until the Duke had personally visited their estate, with evidence so damning that refusal to heed it would have been foolish beyond reason. The letter confirmed everything Evelyn had already begun to suspect, but it also raised a troubling question that had been forming slowly in the back of her mind since Harold Grant's unsettling visit weeks earlier. If the Duke had gone to such lengths to warn multiple families of Whitmore's scheme, why had her own father received only a single letter, with no personal visit, no additional evidence pressed upon him with the same urgency shown to the Carow family? She decided to seek an answer to a question that had troubled her since finding the letters. What exactly had become of Charles Whitmore in the years since her father's ruin? She made careful inquiries through the household staff, through conversations with visiting guests who might know of the man's current circumstances, and slowly, a picture began to emerge that made her blood run cold. Charles Whitmore had not disappeared in disgrace after his scheme collapsed, as Evelyn might have expected. Instead, he had quietly rebuilt his reputation over the years, distancing himself from the families ruined by his deception, and had recently returned to prominence within certain social circles, presenting himself as a respectable merchant with new business ventures to offer. And most troubling of all, Evelyn learned that Whitmore maintained a close, ongoing friendship with none other than Harold Grant. The realization struck her with the force of a physical blow. Harold Grant, the man who had first painted the Duke as her family's destroyer, who had visited her with such urgent questions about whether she had found proof of the Duke's guilt, was closely connected to the very man whose scheme had actually caused her father's ruin. She began to understand, slowly and with growing horror, the shape of what might have truly happened all those years ago. If Whitmore had feared exposure for his scheme, and if Harold Grant had perhaps profited alongside him in ways her father never knew, then redirecting blame onto the Duke, a man already known for his cold, distant manner, and easy to paint as villainous in the court of public opinion, would have served both their purposes perfectly. It would have protected Whitmore from scrutiny, and ensured that Evelyn's own suspicions, when they eventually formed, would be aimed at entirely the wrong man. The thought made her feel ill, both for the deception that had shaped so much of her recent life, and for the years her father had spent, in his final months, believing himself betrayed by a man who had actually tried to save him. She needed more than suspicion now. She needed proof, something concrete enough to expose both Whitmore and Grant in front of the very society that had so readily accepted the false story of the Duke's guilt. And she needed to decide, once and for all, how to tell the Duke everything she had done, everything she now understood, without losing whatever fragile connection had grown between them, despite the lies at the foundation of their marriage. Her chance to gather more evidence came in an unexpected form, when Lady Winifred Carow, moved by Evelyn's careful inquiries, invited her to a small private gathering where several of the families who had escaped Whitmore's scheme would be present, along with, unfortunately, Whitmore himself, who had apparently charmed his way back into enough good graces to receive an invitation despite his history. Evelyn attended the gathering with careful composure, her nerves stretched thin beneath a calm exterior, as she watched Whitmore move through the room with easy confidence, greeting old acquaintances as though nothing had ever tarnished his reputation. He was an older man, silver-haired and pleasant-faced, with none of the obvious cruelty one might expect from someone capable of ruining so many families through calculated deception. It was, Evelyn realized with a chill, precisely the sort of harmless appearance that would allow a man to deceive so many people for so long. She engaged him in conversation carefully, introducing herself simply as Lady Ashworth, without mentioning her married name, curious whether he would recognize the connection to her father. Ashworth, Whitmore repeated, a flicker of something crossing his face, before he smoothed it away, with practiced ease. I once knew a gentleman by that name, many years ago. A dear friend, in fact, though we lost touch before his passing. I was deeply saddened to hear of it. Were you? Evelyn said carefully, watching his expression for any further sign of what he might be hiding. I understand my father invested rather heavily in a business venture, some years before his death. I have often wondered about the details. Something shifted behind Whitmore's eyes, quick and calculating, though his pleasant smile never wavered. Business dealings can be complicated, my lady, and often end poorly, through no fault of any single party. I would not trouble yourself with such matters. The past is best left where it belongs. The evasion confirmed more for Evelyn than any direct answer could have, and she filed the exchange away carefully, understanding now that she needed to find someone willing to speak plainly about Whitmore's scheme, someone with less to lose from exposing the truth than the families still trying to forget how close they had come to ruin. She found that person in an unlikely form, a former clerk of Whitmore's, a young man named Thomas Aldridge, who had once handled the merchant's correspondence before leaving his employment under circumstances that Lady Caro described as suspicious and hurried. Evelyn arranged, through careful and discreet inquiry, to meet with Aldridge at a small tea-house away from the prying eyes of noble society, and there, over cups of tea neither of them touched, she finally heard the full truth of what had happened. Aldridge spoke nervously at first, clearly fearful of the consequences should Whitmore learn of their conversation. But as Evelyn assured him of her discretion and her genuine need to understand the truth for her family's sake, he began to open up about the scheme he had witnessed unfold from within Whitmore's own household. He never had the ships he claimed, Aldridge said quietly, glancing toward the door, as though expecting someone to burst in at any moment. The whole venture was built on nothing but promises, and the money of new investors used to pay the returns promised to earlier ones. When the Duke of Blackwood began asking questions, Mr. Whitmore grew frightened, truly frightened, my lady. He knew the Duke's reputation for thoroughness, and he feared exposure above all else. What did he do? Evelyn asked, her heart pounding. He turned to Mr. Grant for help, Aldridge said. The two of them had worked together on smaller ventures before, and Mr. Grant agreed to help spread word that the Duke himself was behind schemes to ruin honest men for his own profit, twisting the truth entirely, to protect Whitmore from scrutiny. Your father, my lady, was perhaps the most tragic victim of that deception. He trusted Mr. Grant's account over the Duke's warning, and by the time he might have discovered the truth, it was already too late. Evelyn sat in stunned silence, the full shape of the betrayal finally clear before her. Her father had died believing himself betrayed by the Duke, when in truth, he had been betrayed by a man he considered a trusted friend, working in concert with the very villain whose scheme had destroyed his fortune. She thanked Aldridge for his honesty, promising to protect his identity as best she could, and made her way home, with her mind racing through the enormous task now before her, exposing both Whitmore and Grant, restoring the Duke's reputation, and finding some way to confess to her husband everything she had done in the months since their marriage began, all without destroying whatever fragile connection had grown between them, despite the lies that had brought her into his life. The days following her meeting with Thomas Aldridge passed in a blur of careful planning and mounting anxiety. Evelyn now possessed enough understanding to expose the truth behind her father's ruin, but she carried the knowledge like a burning coal in her hands, uncertain of the safest way to set it down without harming everyone involved, including herself. She had not yet told the Duke anything, and the longer she waited, the heavier the weight of her silence became. Each morning at breakfast, each quiet evening spent in his company, she felt the deception pressing against her chest like a physical ache, made worse by the growing certainty that her feelings for him had become something far removed from the cold arrangement she had entered into for the sake of revenge. She realized, watching him work through correspondence at his desk one evening, the lamplight catching the tired lines around his eyes, that she no longer wished to expose him to satisfy some old grudge. She wished to protect him, to restore the reputation that had been stolen from him through no fault of his own, and to finally be honest with him about everything, regardless of what it might cost her. But before she could gather the courage to confess, circumstances forced her hand in a way she had not anticipated. Harold Grant returned to Blackwood Manor unannounced one gray afternoon, his manner far more agitated than during his previous visits. Evelyn received him with careful composure, though her heart pounded with the knowledge of everything she now understood about his role in her father's ruin. "I have heard troubling rumors, Evelyn," he said without preamble, pacing the small drawing room with obvious tension. "Word has reached me that you have been asking questions, meeting with people connected to old business matters best left forgotten. I must ask you, as someone who cared deeply for your father, to leave this matter alone. Why would seeking the truth trouble you so greatly, Mr. Grant?" Evelyn asked, keeping her voice steady despite the racing of her heart. "Surely, if the Duke is truly responsible for my father's ruin, evidence of that truth would only strengthen the case against him." Harold's expression flickered, something sharp and calculating crossing his features before he composed himself. "The past should remain buried, Evelyn. Digging into old wounds serves no purpose but to cause further pain. I am only thinking of your well-being." "Are you?" Evelyn said quietly, watching him with new eyes, understanding now the desperation beneath his carefully maintained concern. "Or are you thinking of your own, Mr. Grant?" The color drained from Harold's face, and for a moment, Evelyn saw something close to panic flash across his features before he mastered himself once more. "I do not understand your meaning," he said, though his voice carried none of its earlier confidence. "I think you understand perfectly," Evelyn replied. "I have learned a great deal these past weeks, Mr. Grant, about Charles Whitmore's business dealings, and about the assistance he received from a trusted friend in spreading falsehoods about the true architect of my father's ruin. I wonder how you managed to sleep at night, knowing the truth, while allowing an innocent man to bear the blame for your friend's crimes." Harold's composure shattered entirely then, his face contorting with a mixture of fear and desperate anger. "You do not understand the situation you are meddling in," he said, his voice low and urgent. "Whitmore is not a man to be trifled with, Evelyn. And neither, I fear, am I. Whatever you think you know, I would advise you to keep it to yourself, for your own sake." The threat, thinly veiled as it was, sent a chill through Evelyn's chest, but she refused to let her fear show on her face. "Are you threatening me, Mr. Grant?" "I am advising you," he said, straightening his coat with hands that trembled slightly, despite his attempt at composure. "The truth you seek will bring you nothing but sorrow, and possibly danger you cannot imagine. Leave the past buried, Evelyn, before it buries you along with it." He departed shortly after, leaving Evelyn alone in the drawing room with her heart pounding, and her resolve, if anything, strengthened rather than diminished by his poorly disguised threat. She understood now, with absolute clarity, that she could not delay any longer. The truth needed to come out, both for the sake of her father's memory and for the safety of everyone involved, and she needed the Duke's help to bring it fully into the light. She found him in his study that evening, working through the last of his correspondence before retiring for the night, and she stood in the doorway for a long moment, gathering the courage to finally speak the truth she had carried for so long. "Your Grace," she said finally, her voice trembling slightly, despite her best efforts to remain composed. "I have something I must tell you, and I fear it will change everything between us." He looked up from his desk, something in her tone immediately drawing his full attention, and gestured for her to enter and take a seat across from him. "You seem troubled, Lady Ashworth. Whatever it is, you may speak freely." Evelyn took a steadying breath and began, from the very beginning, to tell him everything. She spoke of her father's death, of the crushing debts discovered in its aftermath, of Harold Grant's insistence that the Duke himself had orchestrated the family's ruin through calculated business cruelty. She spoke of her decision to seek marriage with him, not out of any genuine desire for partnership, but as a means to gain access to his private affairs and uncover proof of his guilt. The Duke's expression remained carefully neutral as she spoke, though Evelyn could see the muscles in his jaw tightening with each new revelation. She continued, describing the night she had been caught in his study, the fire that had given her a second opportunity, the letters she had found hidden in the locked drawer, and finally, the full truth she had uncovered about Charles Whitmore and Harold Grant's role in spreading false accusations against him. When she finished, silence stretched between them, heavy and uncertain, and Evelyn braced herself for whatever anger or betrayal he might now express toward her. "You married me," he said slowly, his voice carefully controlled, "believing me responsible for your father's ruin. You spent months in my home, searching my private papers, all while pretending affection you did not feel. Yes, Evelyn said quietly, unable to deny the truth of it, despite how painful it was to hear spoken aloud. I am sorry, Your Grace. I should have sought the truth before allowing my anger to lead me into such deception. And yet, he continued, studying her with an expression she could not fully read, you have just handed me the very proof of my innocence that would restore my reputation, knowing full well it might mean the end of whatever trust remained between us. Why would you do such a thing, if not out of some genuine change of heart? Evelyn met his gaze, her own eyes bright with unshed tears. Because I could no longer bear the weight of deceiving you, Your Grace. Because somewhere in these past months, my reasons for staying in this marriage stopped being about revenge and became something else entirely. I do not expect your forgiveness, but I could not continue living beside you while carrying such a lie. The Duke rose from his desk and moved to stand before her, his expression softening into something Evelyn had never seen from him before, a vulnerability that made her breath catch in her chest. I sensed, weeks ago, that something troubled you deeply, he said quietly. I did not know the full shape of it, but I suspected you carried some purpose beyond simple duty in agreeing to marry me. I confess, Lady Ashworth, that I have grown to care for you a great deal more than I ever intended when I first proposed this arrangement, and I find myself now uncertain how to reconcile that with the truth you have just shared. I understand if you cannot forgive the deception, Evelyn said softly. I did not say I could not forgive it, he replied, only that I need time to understand it fully. But first, we must address the more urgent matter at hand. Whitmore and Grant have caused enough damage through their lies. It is time the truth was finally brought into the light, for both our sakes. Over the following days, Evelyn and the Duke worked together with a quiet, careful purpose that neither of them had expected when their marriage first began. Whatever pain remained between them from her earlier deception seemed to settle into something they had silently agreed to address once the more pressing matter of Whitmore and Grant had been resolved. For now, they moved as partners, united in their determination to bring the truth into the light. The Duke revealed to Evelyn that he had long suspected the rumors surrounding her father's ruin had not arisen naturally, but he had never possessed enough evidence to trace the falsehood back to its true source. With Evelyn's information about Thomas Aldridge and the connection between Whitmore and Grant, he now had the missing pieces needed to build a case strong enough to expose both men publicly. We will need Aldridge to speak plainly and publicly about what he witnessed, the Duke said, as they sat together in his study, reviewing the evidence Evelyn had gathered. A private confession means little against men of Whitmore and Grant's social standing. We need witnesses, willing to speak in front of others who matter. He was frightened when I spoke with him, Evelyn said. He feared retaliation from Whitmore if his testimony became known. Then we must offer him protection, and perhaps opportunity as well, the Duke replied. A man who fears for his livelihood can be persuaded to find courage when his future is secured rather than threatened. They spent the following days quietly building their case, the Duke reaching out through careful channels to secure Aldridge's cooperation, with promises of employment and protection from any consequence Whitmore might attempt to bring against him. Lady Winifred Carow, once informed of the full truth behind the scheme that had nearly ruined her own family, agreed readily to lend her voice and reputation to support the Duke's case, grateful for the chance to finally see justice served against the man who had so nearly destroyed her household's fortune. Evelyn found herself growing closer to the Duke throughout this process, their shared purpose creating a bond that felt entirely different from the cold, practical arrangement they had begun their marriage with. He spoke to her now not as a distant husband managing a convenient wife, but as a true partner, seeking her thoughts on strategy, trusting her judgment in ways that surprised her each time she recognized it. One evening, as they reviewed their gathered evidence together, in the quiet of his study, the Duke set down the papers he had been examining and looked at her with an expression of quiet consideration. I find myself grateful, in a strange way, for the circumstances that brought us together, he said. Had you not married me, seeking proof of my guilt, we might never have uncovered the truth of what truly happened to your father, nor exposed the men responsible for so much suffering among the families they deceived. I still carry guilt for how I entered this marriage, Evelyn admitted quietly. For the months I spent deceiving you, searching for evidence of a crime you never committed, Guilt serves little purpose once the wrong has been set right, he said gently. You have shown more courage in confessing the truth and helping to correct it than most people would manage in your position. I find I can hold no lasting anger towards someone who ultimately chose honesty over continued deception, especially when that honesty came at such personal risk to herself. The warmth in his voice, the genuine understanding in his expression, settled something deep within Evelyn's chest that had been unsettled since the moment she first learned the truth of his innocence. She realized, watching him across the desk in the soft lamplight, that whatever fear or resentment had once defined their relationship had transformed into something she had never expected to find in a marriage born of revenge, a genuine, growing affection that felt entirely unforced. Their careful planning, however, did not go unnoticed. Word of Evelyn's inquiries had clearly reached Whitmore through Harold Grant's network of connections, and the two men began to grow increasingly desperate as the walls closed in around their old deception. Evelyn received an unsettling note one afternoon, unsigned but clearly intended as a warning, suggesting that continued interference in matters best left in the past might bring unwanted consequences upon those she cared about. She showed the note to the Duke immediately, her hands trembling slightly, as she recalled Harold's veiled threat during his last visit. The Duke's expression darkened as he read the words, his jaw tightening with barely controlled anger. They grow desperate, he said, setting the note aside with careful control. Desperate men make mistakes, Evelyn, and their attempts to frighten us into silence only confirm the guilt they are so eager to hide. We will proceed as planned, but we must take greater care to protect those who have agreed to testify on our behalf. He arranged for additional protection for Thomas Aldridge and increased security around the manor itself. Careful precautions, taken without drawing undue attention to the growing tension building beneath the surface of their careful investigation. Evelyn found herself grateful for his steady presence during these uncertain days. His calm, measured approach to danger, a stark contrast to the fear that occasionally threatened to overwhelm her own resolve. It was Lady Caro who suggested the perfect opportunity to bring their case fully into the light. A grand gathering already planned at the estate of Lord Pembroke, the very location where Evelyn had first met the Duke so many months earlier. An event that would draw together nearly every prominent noble family in the region, including, Lady Caro confirmed through careful inquiry, both Charles Whitmore and Harold Grant, who had recently secured invitations through their carefully maintained social connections. It is fitting, in a way, Evelyn said, when the Duke suggested using the gathering as the stage for their revelation. That is where our story began. Perhaps it is right that it should also be where the truth finally comes to light. The Duke studied her for a long moment, something warm and genuine in his gaze that had nothing to do with their shared purpose of justice. Our story began there, yes, he said quietly. But I find myself hoping, Evelyn, that whatever comes next for us will be a story of our own making, rather than one built upon the schemes of men like Whitmore and Grant. Evelyn felt her heart lift at his words, a warmth spreading through her chest that she had not expected to feel toward the man she had once believed to be her family's greatest enemy. Whatever came next, whatever danger or difficulty still lay ahead in exposing the truth, she found herself facing it now not alone, but beside a partner she had come to trust and care for, in ways she never could have imagined when this journey first began. The night of Lord Pembroke's gathering arrived with a tension Evelyn could feel humming beneath her skin as their carriage made its way up the familiar drive toward the grand estate. She wore a gown of deep emerald, chosen carefully for the confidence it lent her, and beside her, the Duke sat in composed silence, his mind clearly turning over the details of the plan they had spent weeks preparing. "Are you ready for this?" he asked, as the carriage rolled to a stop before the brightly lit entrance of Pembroke Hall.
As ready as I will ever be,"
Evelyn replied, though her heart pounded with a mixture of anticipation and fear for what the evening might bring. The gathering was as grand as Evelyn remembered from her first meeting with the Duke, the ballroom filled with the glittering light of countless candles, the air thick with music, and the low hum of 100 conversations. She spotted Whitmore almost immediately, standing near the refreshment table in easy conversation with several noble families, his pleasant smile firmly in place, entirely unaware of the reckoning that awaited him this evening. Harold Grant stood not far away, and Evelyn noticed the slight tension in his shoulders, the careful way his eyes scanned the room, as though searching for any sign of trouble. Thomas Aldridge had arrived earlier, dressed in a suit of clothes far finer than his usual attire, standing near Lady Caro, with the nervous energy of a man about to speak a truth he had long feared to voice. The Duke had arranged everything with careful precision. Lord Pembroke himself had agreed to call the gathering's attention at the appropriate moment, allowing the truth to be presented before witnesses too numerous and too respected for Whitmore or Grant to easily dismiss or discredit. The moment came just as the evening reached its peak, when Lord Pembroke raised his voice to call for the attention of his assembled guests, announcing that a matter of considerable importance to several families present required addressing before the night's festivities continued. Evelyn watched Whitmore's expression shift from pleasant confidence to wary confusion as the Duke stepped forward to address the gathered crowd, his voice carrying the calm, measured authority that Evelyn had come to know so well over the months of their marriage. Many of you have heard rumors, over the years, suggesting that I bear responsibility for the financial ruin of several noble families, including that of Lord Ashworth, whose daughter I have since had the honor of marrying. The Duke began, his eyes sweeping across the crowded room. Tonight, I wish to finally set the record straight, with the help of evidence and witnesses who can speak to the true events of that time. A murmur rippled through the crowd, and Evelyn saw Whitmore's face pale slightly, though he maintained his composure with the practiced ease of a man accustomed to navigating difficult social situations. Harold Grant, however, looked considerably more shaken, his eyes darting toward the exits, as though calculating whether escape remained a viable option. The Duke presented his case methodically, calling first upon Lady Caro to speak of the warning he had personally delivered to her family years earlier, a warning that had saved their fortune from the very scheme that had ultimately claimed Lord Ashworth's. Lady Caro spoke with clear, confident conviction, praising the Duke's foresight and describing in detail the evidence he had shown her family regarding Whitmore's fraudulent business dealings. Next, the Duke called upon Thomas Aldridge, who stepped forward with trembling hands but a steady voice, describing his years working within Whitmore's household, witnessing firsthand the construction of a scheme built entirely on false promises and the money of new investors used to pay the returns claimed by earlier ones. He spoke of the panic that had gripped Whitmore when the Duke's investigation began closing in, and the desperate alliance formed with Harold Grant to redirect blame away from the true architects of the scheme and onto the Duke himself. The crowd's murmurs grew louder, sharper, as the full shape of the deception became clear to those assembled. Evelyn watched Whitmore's carefully maintained composure finally crack, his face contorting with a mixture of fear and fury as he realized the trap that had been so carefully constructed around him. "These accusations are baseless," Whitmore said, his voice carrying a desperate edge beneath its forced confidence. "This clerk speaks lies, no doubt paid for by the Duke himself to salvage his own damaged reputation." "Perhaps you would care to explain, then," the Duke said calmly, producing a final piece of evidence from within his coat, "why my own letters to Lord Ashworth, warning him explicitly of your scheme, years before his ruin, exist in my private study, dated and verified by witnesses who received similar warnings at the same time. I did not fabricate evidence to salvage my reputation, Mr. Whitmore. I merely failed to convince every family I warned, including, tragically, the one I have since come to consider my own." Evelyn stepped forward then, her heart pounding, but her voice steady, addressing the crowd directly for the first time that evening. "I have seen these letters myself," she said. "I found them hidden in my husband's study, written years before our marriage, warning my father explicitly against the very scheme that eventually destroyed his fortune. My father did not heed that warning, trusting instead in the friendship of a man he believed loyal." She turned her gaze deliberately toward Harold Grant, watching him flinch beneath the weight of her stare. "A friendship, I have since learned, built entirely on lies, designed to protect the true villain of this story." Harold Grant's composure shattered entirely under the combined weight of evidence and public scrutiny, and in the desperate silence that followed, he made a fatal mistake, attempting to defend himself with explanations so contradictory and unconvincing that even his closest allies in the crowd began to draw away from him with expressions of dawning realization and disgust. Whitmore, seeing his old partner's collapse, attempted to flee the gathering entirely, but Lord Pembroke had anticipated exactly this possibility. having quietly arranged for the local magistrate to be present among the evening's guests. The magistrate stepped forward calmly, requesting that both Whitmore and Grant remain to answer further questions regarding the evidence presented, and the two men, faced with the impossibility of escape before an audience of the region's most powerful families, had no choice but to comply. As the gathering slowly began to process the enormity of what had just been revealed, Evelyn felt the Duke's hand find hers, his fingers lacing through her own, with a gentle strength that steadied the racing of her heart. She looked up at him, and found him already watching her, his expression carrying a warmth and pride that made her breath catch in her chest. "It is done," he said quietly, for her ears alone. "The truth is finally known." "Thanks to both of us," Evelyn replied softly. "I could not have uncovered any of this without you, and you could not have proven your innocence so completely without the evidence I found." Around them, the gathering slowly returned to its usual rhythms, though the air remained charged with the shock of what had just unfolded, and Evelyn understood, standing there with her hand in the Duke's, that the story of vengeance and deception that had brought them together had finally, truly, reached its resolution. What remained now was simply the question of what would come next, for both of them, in the life they had built together despite everything that had once stood between them. Spring arrived at Blackwood Manor with a gentleness that Evelyn had not expected to feel after the turbulence of the previous months, the gardens surrounding the great house bursting into color, as though the world itself had chosen to celebrate the truth finally brought into the light. Whitmore and Grant faced the full consequences of their years of deception, their reputations destroyed beyond any hope of recovery, their schemes exposed to every family they had once deceived. Justice, slow as it had been in coming, had finally arrived for Evelyn's father, and for every other family who had suffered beneath the weight of their lies. The Duke's reputation, meanwhile, underwent a transformation, as complete as it was overdue. Where once whispered rumors had painted him as cold and ruthless, society now spoke of him with genuine admiration, praising the careful, patient investigation that had finally exposed the truth after years of unjust blame. Evelyn watched, with quiet satisfaction, as the same nobles who had once regarded her husband with wary suspicion now sought his company and counsel with newfound respect. But it was not the restoration of reputation, nor the satisfaction of justice finally served, that occupied Evelyn's thoughts most during those spring days. It was the quiet, steady growth of something she had never expected to find within the marriage she had entered, for reasons of vengeance rather than love. She found the Duke waiting for her one afternoon, in the gardens behind the manor, standing beneath the old oak tree that had become, over the months, one of her favorite places to sit and read during the quiet hours of the day. He held something in his hands, and as she approached, she saw it was a small, carefully wrapped package, tied with simple ribbon, rather than the ostentatious display favored by lesser men trying to impress. "I have something for you," he said, offering the package, with a hesitance that seemed almost boyish, compared to the composed authority she had grown so accustomed to seeing in him. Evelyn opened it carefully, and found inside a small portrait, beautifully rendered, of her father, copied from an old miniature she had once mentioned losing during the upheaval following his death. The artist had captured him exactly as she remembered, warm-eyed and gentle, and Evelyn felt tears rise unbidden as she studied the careful work. "I found the original miniature among some old correspondence your father once sent me, years before his passing," the Duke said quietly. "I thought you might wish to have a copy of your own, something to remember him by, beyond the circumstances of his ruin and death." "Thank you," Evelyn managed, her voice thick with emotion. "This means more to me than I can properly express." "There is something else I wish to say to you," he continued, taking her hand gently in his own. "When you first told me the truth of how our marriage began, I confess I struggled to reconcile my feelings toward you with the deception that had brought us together. But in the months since, watching you fight so fiercely for the truth, watching you risk your own safety, to see justice done not just for your father, but for every family harmed by Whitmore's scheme, I have come to understand something important." Evelyn held her breath, waiting for him to continue, her heart pounding with a hope she had not quite allowed herself to feel until this moment. "I love you," he said simply, the words carrying none of the careful, measured tone he usually reserved for matters of business, but instead a warmth and sincerity that made Evelyn's breath catch in her throat. "Not out of convenience," Not out of the practical arrangement we first agreed to, but genuinely, completely, in a way I never expected to feel for anyone after losing my mother so young. I do not know when it began, exactly, but I know I no longer wish to imagine my life without you beside me. Tears spilled freely down Evelyn's cheeks now, and she found herself laughing softly through them, the joy of the moment overwhelming the careful composure she had maintained through so much difficulty over the past year. "I love you too," she said, her voice trembling with the truth of it. "I did not expect to feel this way when I first came to you, seeking revenge for my father's ruin. I certainly did not expect to fall in love with the very man I once believed to be my family's greatest enemy. But somewhere along the way, watching you show me kindness and patience I did not deserve, watching you forgive a deception that would have justified far greater anger than you ever showed me, I found myself falling for you completely." He drew her close then, and beneath the old oak tree in the gardens of Blackwood Manor, they shared a moment of quiet, genuine happiness that neither of them could have imagined when their story first began months earlier at Lord Pembroke's gathering. The marriage that had started as a calculated act of revenge had transformed, through honesty and shared purpose and the slow, careful building of genuine trust, into something Evelyn had never dared to hope for, a true partnership, built not on deception or convenience, but on love, freely given and gratefully received. In the weeks that followed, Evelyn wrote to distant relatives and old family friends, sharing the news of the truth finally uncovered about her father's ruin, restoring what remained of the Ashworth name among those who had once believed the false rumors spread by Whitmore and Grant. She found comfort, too, in small gestures the Duke made to honor her father's memory, including a quiet donation made in Lord Ashworth's name to a charitable cause he had once supported during his life, a gesture that meant more to Evelyn than any grand celebration could have. Their household settled into a rhythm of genuine warmth and partnership that neither of them had known during the early, cautious months of their marriage. The Duke, no longer burdened by the weight of false accusation, seemed to soften in ways Evelyn had not thought possible, laughing more freely, speaking more openly of his hopes for the future they now shared together. Evelyn, in turn, found herself finally free of the anger and grief that had driven her into this marriage in the first place, replaced instead by a quiet contentment she had not felt since long before her father's death. Standing together in the gardens as the spring sun set over Blackwood Manor, casting warm golden light across the grounds that had once felt so foreign and cold to Evelyn during her first uncertain days as Duchess, she understood that the story that had begun with vengeance in her heart had found its true ending in something far more valuable than any revenge could have provided. She had come to this marriage seeking to destroy a man she believed responsible for her family's ruin. Instead, she had found the truth, restored justice for her father's memory, and discovered, in the most unexpected way imaginable, a partner who loved her not despite the difficult beginning of their story, but perhaps, in some strange way, because of everything that beginning had taught them both about honesty, forgiveness, and the true measure of a person's character. Their marriage, born of deception and revenge, had become, through truth and time and the slow, patient building of genuine trust, a love story neither of them had ever expected to live, but one they would carry together, gratefully, for the rest of their days.